Are we on? Yes, we are. Thank you, Dr. Basha. Thank you, Kyrie. Thank you to new friends Yami and Suk and Daniel. And congratulations to all of you for experiencing this day in the history of the autism community of Malaysia. I am very, very honored to be here as your keynote here this morning. And I would start by sharing a little bit about myself, only in the context that a long time ago, I was a starving playwright in New York City, but I had kind of a cool job to pay the bills with. And that job was, I was a minor league diplomat operating out of the United Nations, working in such romantic places as Bosnia or Cuba, and the largest project I did was Iraq, before we invaded it, obviously, where I was repairing water treatment facilities. And then when our 2 to 4 year old son began to start to develop the same telltale signs that many of you as parents started to notice, such as a speech delay and motor skills issues, and we would buy dog food cans in bulk to save money, and he would stack them in these crazy pyramids in the hallway. So we knew something was up. And so, like many of you, I didn't know anything about these words at that time either. And when the funny word Asperger syndrome started to rear its beautiful but confusing head, I think that what started to happen clearly was that as the clinicians in charge of my son's care were starting to examine him more and come to the conclusion of this word, because of the genetic nature of all of this, they of course were starting to look at dear old daddy out of the corner of their eyes. And one thing led to another, and he and I were diagnosed literally 1 week apart from one another in late 2000. As his father, I couldn't have been more happy because I knew that he wouldn't go through the experiences that I had, where when something would come out of his mouth that had no filter or no context, and other people would think he was rude, well, that wouldn't happen to him. People would understand that it was his wiring, thank you, Dr. Basha, not his character, that was causing this. And for me, it was wonderful because it explained a myriad of mysteries about where I was. Now, I was the lucky one. I had a family, I had a career, and I had been mistaken, I now knew, for being infinitely smarter than I really am. And that had gotten me through a lot of experiences because they thought that I was talented. And when you're talented, they allow you to be a little weird. And what they didn't know is that I wasn't as talented as they thought I was, but you know, I'm not complaining because we're here today because of that particular mistake. You know, the funny thing too was that right after I got diagnosed, I'm going through a whole host of reactions. And one of which is that I always knew that people got me wrong. I just didn't know why. And I would gravitate towards the people that thought I was maybe, you know, talented because they liked me. Because there were a lot of people that thought that I was the rudest human being on planet Earth. And I didn't understand why they thought that. But of course I wasn't going to gravitate towards those who thought that I was rude. Why would I want to hang out with people who don't like me? And in the course of all that, in order to just get by, you of course process and start to believe, okay, I'm a rude person. Who am I to fight the vast majority of the world that believes this, right? So I'll try to do good things in my life. I'll try to be a good husband and a good father and a good friend. But it's okay that I'm a rude person. And then the diagnosis comes. And somebody tells you at the age of 36 years old, guess what? You are not a rude person. Actually, I am a little bit. But I wish I had the words to share with you what a biblical weight that is off your shoulder. That's just tremendous. And I'll tell you one other story before we go into the presentation. At around the same time, I'm hanging out with a friend from graduate school, my friend Scott. And he's just letting me vent, because I'm going through this, you know, thing, you know, with this new diagnosis, and I'm literally reevaluating every event that I've ever gone through in my life through this new context, through this new filter. And people that I thought were really supportive of me in the back, now I see were keeping me at arm's distance because they didn't want anything to do with me. And the people that I thought who were being mean to me when I was a kid, I'm now seeing, no, they were trying to challenge me. They actually were the ones who believed in me and believed that I had potential. So I'm railing through all of this, and one thing I say to my friend Scott too is, it's so wonderful now because I can actually embrace my autism. I can actually, be more autistic because now I know that this is who I am. And Scott just looks at me and he starts laughing and he goes, Michael, no, I got to tell you something. You seem 20 times less autistic now. And Scott was right. Because when you are going through life with the anxiety of pretending to be somebody who you are not, of course that's going to present an enormous amount of anxiety. This presentation, the new look at the needs of teens and adults on the autism spectrum, really derives more from my years at GRASP, which was how I made my name in the autism Asperger world. The books and the consulting stuff came later. And at the time, you have to understand that when you're the head of the largest membership organization in the world of adults on the spectrum, you hear more stories than anybody in the world. And it's not because you're anything brilliant or anything smart. It's just because of the nature of your job. And these stories are magnificent, they are beautiful, and they are overwhelming not only in their quantity, but in their quality. And one of the things that I want to do for you today here, though, is that if there's a new look, there has to have at one point been an old look. And we are going to go through that here today, only because I want you to know our history from the West in terms of how we've processed all this stuff. Because one of the things that all my new friends have been sort of talking about that I would like to disagree with since I arrived in Malaysia 4 days ago is this notion, well, we're behind. I don't want you to think like that. Because if you knew, and I'm hopefully going to share this with you, and I apologize a little bit because, we all want to talk about happy things, but we have a history of so many mistakes. And because of this gathering here, because you are starting with a blank canvas, you are not putting up a new building where an old building needs to be torn down. You have an opportunity to avoid the huge mistakes that we made in getting to the place that we are now. And your trajectory, I have incredibly more optimism than I do in anything that we'll be able to do because of the fact that you're not having to unravel the negative iconography that was built up so much in our country, and you can just steam forward ahead with the positive vibrations that you obviously have in your souls. So thank you and shukran for that spirit. One of the things we're going to look at is just an outline here today. Okay, we're going to do a setup, and we're going to talk about the situation on the ground. If you ask any journalist, how do you construct a story? The first thing they're going to say is, well, we got to figure out what the situation on the ground is. But then after that, what's the next step? What's the history? And that's where we're going to explore the history of autism from the West and sort of how these ideas and the humanism that Kyrie spoke so eloquently about really developed, but only after periods of intense anti-humanism. Then we're going to sort of look at some potentially redundant charts. Hopefully they're not really going to be that redundant, I just kind of say that. And then maybe we will focus a little bit on some of the side issues that pop up with the autism spectrum, such as socialization, families, work, and disclosure. I hope in these particular slides, there'll be one for each one of those subjects, and I hope to give you the impression that I could go on for 5 hours about every single one of those slides, okay? And you're very lucky that we're not going to be doing that. But I leave you with the idea that there's more to be explored, hopefully, on those perspectives. And then at the end, we'll just have a closing. I doubt we'll get to a Q&A. I always put that up, but I talk too much, so we never get to the Q&A. But I promise I'm open, I'm gregarious, I'm very loose. You can, come talk to me whenever. So, all right, situation on the ground. Right now, what we have is autism in general is an infinitely different diagnosis than many other non-apparent disabilities. Okay? When we think of Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis, for instance, we get a very clear mental picture of what that diagnosis looks like in our mind. With autism, holy cow, is that not the case? With autism, okay, you've got all these famous people being diagnosed in retrospect. Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, Thomas Jefferson, Beethoven, Mozart, Emily Dickinson, basically every famous mathematician that ever was born, okay? And on the other end, you have somebody who might never acquire speech and who might not be able to hold down a steady job for a very long time or be capable of an intimate relationship and yet still have the same capacity for happiness as anybody else. That's confusing for the average Joe and Jane, as we like to call them in the United States, on the street. And that's confusing messaging that we sometimes have to structure in order to get the word out about this particular world of autism. We have nowhere near adequate school placements available, and we all know that for the most part that's just a budgetary issue. A plethora of butcherous clinicians. What does that mean? It basically just means that we have done such a good job of spreading autism awareness all around the globe, and especially where I come from, that in essence we've kind of created our own economic market. And there are, of course, people that want to be able to jump in on that market. And if one of my autistic guys from one of my grassroots, for instance, decides, I really need a therapist, and so they go on the white pages and they call up a therapist and they say, do you know your Asperger's pretty well? And let's say the therapist read one page out of the DSM-4, and just the bullet points. And of course they'll say, oh yeah, sure, I know my Asperger's. Well, they don't, just from reading the one page. And in those situations, very often, irreparable damage can be caused. Because just as we sometimes need to be educated in a school, so too do we need to be treated differently in a therapeutic session. So just get references and watch them, but we're here because of the clinical world, so I certainly don't want to invalidate any of the remarkable stuff they've done. Kyrie, it's 1 in 59 now. The CDC just came out with new numbers, so I hope you'll forgive me for putting that up there, but they are very recent, I promise you. But we keep growing and the numbers keep growing in part because we have this giant warehouse that really needs to be emptied before we're going to really know what those true numbers are. Okay? When we think about how many people have been incarcerated in prisons that never got the attention of diagnosis, when we think about the elderly who have been institutionalized way back as far as the 1950s, who could have been helped because they just had autism spectrum conditions, and then they were misdiagnosed, and then they were given misprescribed pharmaceuticals to treat the misdiagnosis, which led to further side effects, which caused further misdiagnosis, and they've been in these institutions for how long? These are all cans of worms that we're never going to have the answers for, and so our search for what those real numbers may be, like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and that we just never really get to them anyway. But I would say, on another note, another reason we may never know the true numbers is because we are doing a great job of allowing people like me to have great jobs or to have great families. And the more that, let's say, somebody who 30 years ago would have been stigmatized and basically told, by the dating world, don't date this particular person. Well, that person is now dating because of all the great work that we've done. And what do we do when we date? Well, sometimes we get married and sometimes we procreate. So I don't want to give you a we're taking over the world scenario here, but there's a little bit of truth there. What's out there for adults? As I think we've all become quite aware of, whatever hardships parents go through to get the services that their kids are entitled to on whatever laws you're under, that is Disneyland compared to what's going to happen to them when they become adults and they age out of those particular systems. We have problems in the autism world. We fight, and this is going to be part of the negative stuff that I want to share with you. I would like to show you a picture in the next slide, and I want the bravest of you to raise your hands and tell me what the first word is that comes to your mind when you see that picture. Meltdown. Meltdown. Unhappy. Sorry? In their own imagination, okay? This is a picture, indeed, of a nonverbal autistic woman. Her name is Amanda Baggs. Amanda is non-speaking in a verbal sense, but she has a blog, and she types using one of those communication devices. And her blog is called something like Ballast Existens, and Amanda can be very militant sometimes, and when I was an executive director, believe me, she could be a pain in the rear end plenty of times. But Amanda is also very smart. And this is Amanda's description of this particular photo of her. This is what I look like when I'm trying to relax or zone out a little or shut off vision so that I can hear what is going on around me. I have no doubt that someone could use this image to show the tragedy and despair inherent in autism. Black and white images such as these and the captions that go along with them are designed to create a reaction. Most often, disability organizations run by non-disabled people use them to elicit pity and money at the expense of the truth. Look at the autistic person in her own world, they say. Isn't it tragic? What I am doing in this photograph is no different than someone curling up with a good book to unwind after a long day. Some autistic people would even say that it's bad to publish pictures that look like this. Better to publish the ones that make us look like real people. That was a dig at me at the time. And a well-deserved one. Those are the better pictures. I say that plays straight into the hand of people who think there's something wrong with the way we look. This is that list of famous people compiled just from 3 books. Okay? If that list looks kind of busy and you can't even read the screen, that's part of the point. There are more books diagnosing more and more famous people on the spectrum. And yet we have somebody like Amanda, behind. So you can tell how complex this diagnosis really is. And up here, this is a chart that I created a long time to sort of describe what our autism world really looked like. And I didn't really know how to, they were very pro-cure. Cure is kind of a bad word we've discovered. I'm happy to say, because I certainly didn't like the word. And there were research organizations at the time, especially Autism Speaks, that really talked about autism only in the context of a tragedy. That these people have awful lives, that the parents are just burdened simply, and give us money so that we can get rid of this heinous diagnosis and come up with let's say the pregnancy test you can take for Down syndrome and have the choice, at least where I come from, to terminate the pregnancy. That's kind of what a lot of the research was all about. And then there were things like vaccine theory organizations. We had national parents organizations, you'll see at the bottom, being pushed out of the picture. And that was actually truly happening. And it makes sense because locals leading locals will always have a better impact no matter where you are. And that was where the regional parents organizations came in as well. The only thing that's accurate about this is the size of the planets is relative to the budgets of those particular organizations. Where I have used complete emotional manipulation here is that the ones that I don't like, I've made look like the Death Star from Star Wars. And of course, my old organization is in the light. So, and now I want you to see, if you want to talk about a dysfunctional universe that we come from, let's take a look at who gets along with who. We're back to grade school, okay? But this is, unfortunately, this is our history. This is what we've had to go through. But what have we fought about? We fought about the language, like the word cure. Cure to me was always a word that was both medically and ethically inaccurate when it came to autism, because when you're born with something, you're going to die with it. That's the whole nature of something that is genetic. And it was ethically inaccurate because, we don't get to simply absorb the opinions of other people in terms of how they want to refer to us. We're supposed to, anybody from any sort of a marginalized community gets ownership of the words. So if you were to have an African American male telling an Asian American female what words should and should not offend her, that would be wrong. Just as if you were to have a white female telling a Hispanic male what words should and should not offend him. And that, of course, too, is wrong. So, we were being told not to be offended by the word cure. And to us, that was actually an offensive word. And we won. Yeah. The vaccine debate. How much time have we wasted where I come from that we are still wasting? How much media attention could go towards getting services to people who need them if it wasn't about more of this nonsensical idea that autism comes from vaccines that we have proven over and over and over again is simply not true. It is a primarily genetic condition with environmental exacerbators. And very often, I just find that this comes from moms and dads that don't want to look in the mirror. Aversives. If you don't know what this word means, it basically means what restraints can we use on somebody, let's say, that's in that really scary, really draconian institution that they might put somebody who is really, really challenged and just there, the family is too poor. We all get it. The centers are always going to exist. But the whole notion of the laws that govern them really very often can go completely against the Geneva Convention. For instance, in the United States, where I come from, you're allowed to do things to people in these institutions that you would be arrested for assault on the street if it was done outside these institutions. That's a whole can of worms that I can get into later, but it's also the question of who implements the aversive inside. How many people have to sign off on the aversive before it's happened? Do we need a PhD to say, okay, we can apply an aversive to this individual? Or is it the 17-year-old orderly who just got out of jail that gets to make that decision? We don't know. And it's different in every place. It's an awful can of worms. Research, what kind of research? Everybody thinks, oh, well, autism research is all great. Well, again, if an organization is trying to come up with a pregnancy test that can predetermine an autism diagnosis, that's one thing, but if they then tell families, average working class families with a child of autism, come walk in our walks to raise money for our cause because it will help your child. And the fact is the medical research like that won't help any individual with an autism diagnosis for 50 years. So there's a lot of very disingenuous stuff that goes around. We've talked about educational research sometimes, and where I come from, I want the educational research to stop, not because I don't believe in it. It's wonderful. But we've got stacks in a warehouse sitting there that have yet to be implemented into the schools. And I want the money actually to go to implementing that wonderful research more into the schools rather than just paying for more research so that it gets more backed up in the warehouse. What we put less than 2% where I come from of the autism research funding into is helping the living. How many people out there need jobs? How many people out there need housing? How many people out there, we don't even know who's diagnosed with what particular autism spectrum disorder out there. And we need to know that information. And if you ever want to see something really comical, the first ever congressional hearings on autism, which I was one of 2 people diagnosed on the spectrum to take part in, happened in 2012. And it was just an anti-vaccine show versus those who believe, it was just, I don't even have the words to describe it for you. But, what of course is the secret to comedy? Tragedy. That's still on the C-SPAN website. You know what, I've got one here, I forgot. So, a brief history of autism. We really start in 1943 when an American child psychologist named Dr. Leo Kanner identifies autism. The things he's looking for are, we're looking at an inability to communicate verbally, a preference of objects to people, disliking of breaks in routine, high intelligence. Remember that one. We're going to come back to that. Remember that. Just 1 year later, this guy named Dr. Hans Asperger, whom we've recently realized some pretty bad things about, but he's not my father, okay? He identified a condition, okay? Big whoop, Things Asperger was looking for was an inability to pick up nonverbal communication, passionate interests, motor skills deficits, and an oddly exhibited use of the spoken word. Now, what starts to happen, though, is that, as we know, Asperger's work took a very, very long time to materialize. Or actually, think of what happened actually before the 1940s. Let me get off track for a second, or risk losing you. Think of how these behavioral differences were interpreted. And it's very funny, we at the GRASP offices, we used to play games when we were bored, and we would sort of spin the globe with our eyes closed, and somebody would say a year like 1853, and then we'd hit the globe with our finger, and we go, okay, what's that culture in 1853? How are they going to interpret the weird guy? And it's fascinating, because some cultures would have said immediately, kill him now. And other cultures would have said, make him the king. It's really amazing. It's really absolutely amazing. But again, don't get lost in that, because I'll lose you and I'll never get you back. After these two discoveries, though, Kanner's work really spread all over the globe, but Asperger's work did not. Now, obviously, there was a world war that played a very, very heavy part in this, and any science being done under the auspices of the Nazi occupation, for very good reasons, was going to come under an inordinate amount of scrutiny compared to anything coming from America, because this was when America was everybody's hope. Everybody wanted our music, our cars, our blue jeans. Well, they also wanted our science, and that's one of the reasons why Kanner's work spread so fast. Asperger's work wasn't even translated into English until the early 1980s by Lorna Wing. And then we came to the 1960s and the early 1970s, where we encounter here the first of two ugly periods in the history of autism. And the first starts with a man named Bruno Bettelheim. I see a show of hands. Does anybody know who Bruno Bettelheim was? Okay. Back in the 60s and 70s, clinical psychologists actually had rock star status sometimes. Like right now you have millions of clinical professionals who are all competing with one another for books, and that's the way it should be. But back during the day, there was usually one, forgive me for keep using this phrase, rock star clinical professional whose every word was bought hook, line, and sinker by the American public. Benjamin Scott was probably the number one with his child-rearing theories from the 1970s, but Bettelheim was probably the second most revered clinical professional. And during this time, Bettelheim did a lot of work on autism, and he had a theory about how you got your autism. You got your autism, not from genes, not from vaccines. You got your autism because your mother wasn't affectionate enough with you in the seconds right after you were born. It's funny, I know. The problem was everybody believed that. If any of you have heard the term refrigerator mother, it comes from this period. Now, there's a lot of women in the audience, so I'm sure you can all imagine that the moms are thinking back and going, it can't be. I know I was affectionate with him as soon as he was born. I know I was. This is nonsense. But just like me, having to accept the fact that I was a rude person, we can't really think of these women as being strong enough to withstand the entire world. So of course they inevitably acquiesce and they give in. And in order to get by, they say, it was my fault. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Now, also, let's say, what are the husbands thinking during this time? This is my wife's fault. She did this to my son. What about the siblings? Oh, don't expect any affection out of mom. Did you see what she did to my brother? And these are during the days, mind you, when parents were very often told, put him in a home and forget you ever had it. This man destroyed thousands upon thousands of families. This is our inheritance. These are the sort of mistakes you will not make. I promise you that. This is somebody who started off on a path towards extreme negative iconography when it comes to words like autism and Asperger's that really prevented what Malaysia has an opportunity for right now, which is assuming the positive right from the get-go, right out of the gate. The odd thing too, just to close on Bruno Bettelheim, after he died, we found out that he had faked all of his doctoral credentials. So the iconography of autism, like what does the word suggest thanks to Bruno Bettelheim, had to do with things like the suggestion of bad mothering, obviously. Highly encouraged separation, child needs to be away from you and you need to forget you ever had the child. So it's logical then to avoid the diagnosis of autism, okay? Autism, as well as all diagnoses, is a very bad thing in this context. And then we come to the late 1970s and in the 1980s, and suddenly, I gotta tell you, everybody got it, like in one collective aha moment, where they realized that the Bruno Bettelheim way of doing things was just utter nonsense, utter just crazy stuff. But instead of finding the emotionally healthy middle ground, we instead then jumped to the immediate opposite. and ended up doing a lot of the same damage. And this is the era when you start to hear this phrase, why do you want to put a label on him? Okay? Labels now are bad. Diagnoses are bad. Okay? And diagnoses under these particular parameters is the stigmatizing mark of something broken. You know, it's something that's written on your tombstone, you know, that you'll never have the possibility of becoming an individual in anybody's eyes because now you have this mark of something broken. But as we know now today, that's not how diagnosis works. Diagnosis and the label is a filter. It's a context through which you will discover who you are as an individual a lot faster than if you don't have that word to help define you. It didn't really have a movement, you know, it wasn't a conscious movement. I call it a movement, so we'll call it anti-labelism just as we sort of move along here. And the iconography of autism under the anti-labelist version was intentionally vague descriptions of all diagnoses as special. This is the first time we hear that word special, whether it's Special Olympics or special education. And actually at the time, it's a vast improvement because it's the first word we've ever used in this context that actually has a positive resonance. The weird thing is that over the years, not because that word has changed, but because we've changed as a people, I actually think that that word has fallen into the category of condescending, and we need to find a new alternative for it. I'm not smart enough to think of what it is, but I think eventually we're going to have to go there. The key really during this time, though, was that word vague. If we keep my son's condition vague, and we don't allow a doctor to put that label on it, then nobody can put any harm to the family. Nobody can come and tell me my son needs to be separated from me. By keeping the aura surrounding the individual undefined, no one could prescribe anything harmful to the family dynamic. Question is, the anti-labelism era, I think, really wanted in every breath to be the exact opposite of the Bruno Bettelheim era. And the question is, did these two eras really contradict each other as much as the anti-labelists hoped? And I think the answer is a very comic, tragic no. I think both of these eras did the same damage to just the words autism or Asperger's syndrome. Both of the words prevented individuals from having a say in their own care, denying self-advocacy, if not the concept altogether. In both of these eras, nobody's telling the individual with autism what he has. And I promise you, we get it. We're different as we're growing up. We get it that it's not working out with our peers. And what everybody needs to realize is that it's the behaviors of the diagnosis that ostracize us from our peers. It's not the label. Our peers don't even know what the label means, okay? It's because we are different at heart. So the label's not gonna mean anything other than a way for the individual to explain why they're different. Because we always assume the negative. We always go there. It's just a very human thing. It's a fear of the unknown. It's not necessarily, you know, like steering towards the negative, but it's a fear of the unknown. If you bring country kids into the city, they want to know why all these weird people aren't locked up. And when you bring city kids out into the country and they hear a bug, they want to kill everything that moves. It's just how human nature is. You know? So both of these attach negative iconography to words like autism and Asperger's. The seeds of where we are today in Healthy began in the 1960s when we first had autobiographical accounts by people like Donna Williams, Temple Grandin, and Thomas McKean, and they're challenging the idea that we're incapable of communication because we're writing books. You know, of course, we're able to communicate then. We had people like Oliver Sacks who, you know, made many documentaries on some of the really special talents that a lot of our people have. I wish I was that talented. But Oliver would, you know, be the guy to always get on PBS, you know, maybe the kid who goes up in the helicopter and can spot the entire skyline of the city and then come back into a room and do the entire charcoal rendering of it. That was all Oliver. And then we come to the most important decade in all of this, and that's the 1990s. And you would think that it starts off in 1994 with what was called the DSM-4 or ICD-10. Because that was the book that first included Asperger's syndrome before we got rid of the word. And this was the book that really sent the prevalence numbers zooming through the roof. The prevalence before that was 1 in 10,000, and then suddenly because of this book it was 1 in 166. Now, everybody in the room might think that that was simply the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome being legitimized by this particular book. Because people, you know, like me, certainly wouldn't have qualified for an autism spectrum diagnosis in the past. But actually in this book, the definition of classic autism also changed. And I hope I'm about to get the numbers right. But under DSM-3, the edition before that, you had to meet 6 mandatory criteria to get a diagnosis of autism. So if you got 5, and you didn't meet the 6th, we had a diagnosis called mental retardation back then. And that was what you got very often. Under this new book, the criteria for classic autism, you had to meet 8 optional out of a field of 16 possibilities. So for you math brains out there, you can understand how that blew those numbers through the roof as well. But no, I think actually in this decade, it started with an article that came out in 1993. The article was an article called "Don't Mourn for Us." It's available on the internet. It's a little angry. And the guy that wrote it is an individual on the spectrum named Jim Sinclair. Jim and I know each other, and he knows that I say that it's a little bit angry, so I'm not speaking out of turn. But during that particular era, I would say that parents had a phrase of my child's life is hell, when really it was all about their life being hell. And if their kid was, able to look at, strobe lights and pretty colors all day long, and, maybe had, shelves to stack for 2 hours a day, a clean diet, and a clean place to live, of course they were going to be perfectly happy. But the parents, obviously, the ones that maybe needed a little bit of help. And Jim wrote an article called "Don't Mourn for Us," which was a scathing assessment of parents at that particular time. And he really took no prisoners. He said, hey parents, maybe it's you that have the problem. Maybe you're ashamed about the fact that your son can't follow in the family tradition of going to Harvard Medical School. Maybe you're just worrying a little bit too much about what the neighbors think. Parents hated this article. But it started the conversation, which was good. And we got to a very healthy place, I think, eventually, only because of this article, where if you do believe in a very pro-family approach like I do, CERTS is a wonderful strategy under those guidelines, that I would argue that the individual has their walk to walk. It is not the parents' walk to walk, it is the individual's. Parents have their walk to walk. It is not the individual's walk to walk, it is the parents' walk to walk. Grandparents have their own walk. Siblings clearly have their walk to walk. And hopefully, everybody has the guts to walk their walk. And then from a pro-family standpoint, join together at the end of the day and share how those walks went. I think that's how we put the pro-family model back into this discussion. And then in the late 1990s, we had more books by people like Leanne Holiday Willey, Jerry Newport, Stephen Shore. We're all fighting each other over book deals and writing second and third books, and that's exactly the way it should be. The difference now was that people were after us for our opinions, not just our experiences. In the United States, we have a show called 60 Minutes, and they did a fair amount of documentaries on autism, but they were all structured in the same way, because they would go to Autistic Johnny and they would say, tell me how bad it was, Johnny, tell me how bad it was. And then they would go to the German accented clinician wearing a white coat, in front of lots of library books, and they would say, doctor, tell us why it was so bad for Johnny. And now, in the new 60-minute episodes, they would stay on Johnny and they say, why do you think things happened the way they do? Vast difference, vast difference. And they dispelled the notion that one size fit all. Some of the myths we've since dispelled, and we used to have many of these, okay? The idea that individuals on the spectrum are passionless, or that we're humorless. This derives from the Mr. Spock from the original Star Trek version of what an individual on the spectrum looks like. But he was our god, so that was okay. We loved Mr. Spock. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take that back, and I'm going to throw an employment point at you. We didn't love Mr. Spock. We envied Mr. Spock. Because Mr. Spock was clearly different, but he was so valued by his coworkers for exactly that reason, for being different. A remarkable TV show from the 1960s, that's for sure. The thing here with the passion and humor thing, though, is that there are not one, but 2 layers of duplicity that cause this particular myth to happen. And the first of which is that we might be triggered, or our sense of passion or what we have as our sense of humor might be triggered by different things. And the second level of difficulty that fooled all the doctors was that we might display passion or humor differently. Very many of us, including myself, have many, times in our lives in which we've laughed when other people thought we should laugh. So, these definitely transpired, with different aspects. No appetite for physical intimacy? Please. We're all great at math, or not. Bullies are eventually punished by life. Not really. 65 to 85% boys? Well, that is the truth for the level of how many people get diagnoses. But how accurate are those diagnoses? How smart are we when we actually look at people and say, could that person be on the autism spectrum? Because we do incredible disservice to girls and still haven't figured out how to really make that change differently. If a girl shakes your hand and doesn't look you in the eye because of gender stereotypes, okay, we still always will say, oh, well, she's just shy. Whereas if a boy doesn't look you in the eye when he shakes your hand, oh, something's wrong with this kid, better get him looked at, okay? Stupid reasons, but that boy has a better chance of getting the diagnosis that could really help him out later on in life, okay? Even if it's because of a stupid reason. A girl doesn't have interest in team sports. She's feminine. But if a boy doesn't have interest in team sports, oh, something's wrong with this kid, better get him looked at. Again, dumb. But that kid has the better chance to get that diagnosis that could really help them out. Later on in life, if they become adults, things become complicated. And I'm going to use a word which I don't like to because it's a little judgmental, but the word is submissive. And if you were to look at the stereotypically submissive adult male, well, probably doesn't have a mate. And so all the uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters are saying, why can't, bachelor Uncle Fred, get a mate? So bachelor Uncle Fred is going to have a better chance at getting the diagnosis that could really help him out because he's being looked at. Now, in our Western society, the stereotypically submissive adult female, oddly enough, primarily, not in all cases, but primarily, will find themselves in a relationship. And unfortunately, these are many of the abusive relationships that you read about in the press. So she may get pitied for a lot of things in life, but will she be looked upon for the autism spectrum diagnosis that she actually has in her? Probably not. One of the huge mistakes that I don't think you're going to replicate at all, that we made as we pitted the parents of significantly challenged children against the parents of people that looked like me, and we had our little civil wars. And those civil wars were really caused by this one idea, that happiness was measured by the ability to communicate. So if your son couldn't talk, but was happy as a clam, he was thought to be unhappy. Whereas somebody who had an IQ of 200, who was expected to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but because nobody explained the social world to them and they were lonely as heck, committed suicide. So the whole notion of that measuring stick for what constitutes a happy life, we understood to be garbage. And we will never go back to that place again. It is the whole question of which one of these extremes in the autism spectrum has the chance for happiness more has nothing to do with their functionality level. It has to do with the quality of supports they have behind them. Actually, I think I just sort of went through this, so skip that. All right, let's get to some charts. All right, what we're going to do with these charts here is we're going to look at some of the bullet-pointed characteristics of the autism spectrum that you see if you look at the diagnosis online in this particular category. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sort of put a very critical interpretation, a very cold, nihilistic, look at that particular characteristic. And then we're going to have a feel-good, crunchy granola, hippy-dippy answer to that particular characteristic. What I would like you to keep in mind as we go along is that neither one of these two columns are any more right or wrong than one another. What it has to do with is the attitudes we, as caregivers, attach to our children in these particular instances. So if we look at intense absorption in a topic or field of interest, Individual is obsessed and is driven further into this absorption by anxiety and stress. The individual is passionate. Okay? One person's obsessed is a happier person's passionate. They mean the same thing. They just have different interpretations. Professorial monotoned manner of speaking. Stilted awkwardness that is off-putting to others, often preventing further steps in a potential relationship. The individual is focused on being clear in what is being said by utilizing a strength, text. Obviously, we're not as great with nonverbal communication, such as gesture or tone, and we like people to be clear. Discomfort or inability at small talk, sees no logic in it. Off-putting and impolite. The individual gets to the point. And for a lot of people, that's actually very refreshing. Problems with imagination. They played out most noticeably when the individual was a child, as a difficulty with imaginative play. In these next two slides, I'm going to play a trick on you. Let's see if you catch what it is. Varying degrees of inability towards imagination and creative or flexible thinking may be indications of a great technical mind. So remember that slide. Problems with non-artistic activities or fields of study can be seen as goofing off or not focused enough on serious matters. Maybe indications of a great creative mind. Anybody see what I just did? I just flipped them. If you go back, okay, creative and technical, and you look at one slide's critical interpretation, it's the same as the instructional positive interpretation basically on the other slide. It's the same person. It's just, this is all so much about how we wake up in the morning and what moods we're in that determine what our interpretations of these actual attributes are. And focus with a little bit of, very clinical dogma language thrown into it. It says, whatever comes into their head, unaware of the potential damage the statement might cause. The individual is rude. The individual is honest. Not that honesty doesn't get you in trouble. It's gotten me in trouble plenty of times. But I think the message here, too, is that our attitudes towards our lives very often is going to be more important than the lives themselves. And there's a greater point in that, which I'll get to at the very end of the presentation. All right, side issues. Socialization, very quickly. Do we really want to? Do we really want to socialize if you're an individual on the spectrum? I think the answer is of course. But is it to the same degree as everybody else? And sometimes when we look at, the socialization potential for our kids, we have to ask this question: how much do they actually really want to? How much is it them trying to please me versus their real desire to socialize? Take a look at the different learning styles. Usually people on the spectrum are one of two categories. They're either visual learners, like a Temple Grandin who can see the diagrams in front of her, or they're math brains who quantify an emotional reaction better than anybody. Because that will play into their potential for socialization. There's also a question about what kind of an education they're getting. Are they in an all-autism school, a special education school, an inclusion school, mainstream? That, too, is going to focus into the socialization component. Common connections, I think, is your best hope. I don't think there's any kind of a fail-safe on this, but we are very passionate about the things that we are interested in. That's what separates us very often. We have just as much potential to fall in love with nonsensical garbage ideas as anybody, but we will put more of our sense of fervor into those ideas, whether they're good ideas or bad ideas. And so if you can get two kids that have a wonderful, wonderful shared interest, unfortunately today, it's mostly, video games, but that's okay. That's going to be the initial basis usually for a chance at friendships. Moving on to families. One of the things that families, I think, need to understand is that master's degrees in neuroscience did not accompany our children when they were born. And that all of us as parents, we are idiots when this stuff first hits our lives, just as individuals are when they first get diagnosed. It's only the clinical professionals and the special education teachers that actually really have, a little bit of preparation and background in this. We don't. We have to go scrambling for information. This is how so many of us ended up with so many of the dumb ideas, that really caused us to lag behind what our potential really was in the West. Stigma of the aforementioned history. I was sharing with Yemi the other night the fact that, she was asking, well, how did your mother take all this when you were diagnosed at the age of 36? Because she grew up during the Bruno Bettelheim days, when if you had stuff like this, you were broken. And it's hard. She accepts what's going on. She accepts the fact that I had the diagnosis. But she feels terrible because she feels like she never understood her own son. And I can present mountains of evidence to her, citing her complete blamelessness over that fact. And it still doesn't really do what I hope it to do with her, because she's my mother. She loves me unconditionally, and she wishes that she knew. It's just hard. We don't get a break from one another in families, okay? And that causes accumulated frustrations. Very often, whether we're the individual on the spectrum or the mom or the dad, we're thinking, wow, I bet everybody remembers the fight we got into 2 months ago. Every day, and they kind of carry that with us. Travel is, oddly enough, I just got a PDF this morning. I've written a 5,000-word article on travel because it's been coming for a long time, because travel was what saved me. And taught me that there was more than one way to look at things, that I didn't have to rely on my parents' generation's ways of doing things, and that I had choices on this earth. And when we are so surrounded with one another, sometimes we just don't get a break. And when you actually deal with strangers, I know that we're conditioned to think that strangers are bad and that we'll do terrible things to our kids, but we need strangers because we can actually share things with them, because they don't know our awful histories. They don't know of the embarrassing thing that we just did 5 days ago. They're a clean slate. We can try and have social experiments with strangers that we wouldn't dare attempt around people that we actually know. And that's where strangers can be very valuable. There's the genetic nature, okay? Again, if you're the dad that, was raised on the idea that people with disabilities were bad or broken, thank you very much. I know I always need those. Then in essence, you are going to have a very hard time with this, okay? But we also need parents to understand you don't have to tell people, but have that look under the hood, because it will help explain your child to you so much more, and it's just the brave thing to do on behalf of your children. So I'm going to speed through some of this stuff. One thing that we, because of the time constraints, but I do want to actually focus on this for those who do not attend my employment presentation later on. But just like there's a big spectrum of functional ability in the autism world, there's a spectrum of behavioral permissibility in various workplaces. And if we had the time, I would love to have some fun and quiz you on all of it, but I'm going to jump to the conclusions. The most behaviorally permissive workplace you could find yourself in other words, where it's completely okay to be the weird guy, is the arts and university life, okay? Whether it's the rock band that trashes the hotel, because that's what they're expected to do, or the crazy professor that yells at you that it's okay because he's a genius, You're allowed different behaviors in these particular professions. The least behaviorally permissive is, oddly enough, the military. But here's the funny thing, because the military can be just as attractive a life for an individual on the spectrum, okay? In the military, you don't have to interpret a thing. They're going to tell you how to behave from the moment you wake up until the moment lights out, and that is heaven for a lot of people on the autism spectrum. It's the 9-to-5 office job that has all the landmines, because the social rules are never explained. They're different in every place, and unfortunately this is where 95% of us are going to be looking for work. So, I'm going to fast through disclosure, which is obviously the science or the art of how to explain to the rest of the world that you have autism. I don't want you to ever make the mistakes that we did in terms of looking for things to blame, okay, such as whether it's the diagnosis itself, whether it's vaccines. This is the emotionally least healthy approach that you could possibly take. There's nobody to blame, but if you really want something to work on, to get rid of, that would be things like anxiety, anger, and depression. And maybe for us, distrust. Because when you live in a world that confuses you, there of course are going to be some trust issues which have to be ironed out later on, and I am no exception to that. Confidence is what we're after with all our kids. Confidence, you don't need money from your parents to gain confidence. Okay? Confidence doesn't care what your body looks like. Confidence can be fabricated, and everybody is an incredibly useful tool of sports. Get the fuck, Who gave you those slides? Best description of all this stuff I've ever heard came from a 5-year-old boy. He had kind of a really great relationship with his pediatrician. They could kind of bust each other's chops a little bit. And the pediatrician at one point said, I know what's going on with you. You've just got too many wires. And the kid said, no, doctor, my problem is that the wires aren't insulated. It's our approach to failure. And when we are overprotected, we fail to achieve some of the very developmental markers that everybody needs in order to understand that failure is not the end of the world. It's by processing repeated failures, just like neurotypical kids, that we learn to have the strength to process them and let the small things roll off our back. I hate to use the word, but it's toughness. It's mental toughness, and we need it just like everybody else does in order to let those small things roll off our back and to gain a thick skin to process failure in general. So, how to solve that? Opportunities to practice independence as early as humanly possible. That biggest obstacle is that no one wants to please more than us. Just like passion is the opposite of obsession to some people, even though it's the same word. Wants to please will also be can't handle rejection to others. This is just how we think. The two wonderful words I like to teach adults on the spectrum are this. So, what do you think the second word is? So what? Oh, that person doesn't like you? So what? Not everybody likes me. Not everybody likes anybody. Okay? So what? I've made grown-ups on the spectrum giggle because they never said these words before, and I forced them to say them. And you could hear the relief and just the absolute epiphany that these two words caused people. We're talking about many things that go into the makeup of what makes a human being a human being. Gender, race, economic background, sexual orientation, neurological makeup, quality of supports, and culture. Which one of these do you think is the most important? We're talking about neurological makeup today, but which of these do you think is the most important? Quality of supports, absolutely. If you are raised to feel good about who you are, no matter who you are, you've got a shot. If you are not raised to feel good about who you are, no matter who you are, you're going to have a much harder time with other people. That's my moment of shameless self-promotion. If you'd like a PDF of this presentation, please email me, michaeljohncarley@gmail.com. That's easy. Best quote I've ever had comes from Helen Keller, who was, as we used to call her, deaf, dumb, and blind. And all three of those words have experienced revolutions of their own. Security is a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. And I am not a Freud guy. Freud slept with his patients, he did very weird things. But he had one brilliant thing to say, and that was, if you really want someone to change, then you have to change. Folks, I can't emphasize enough the opportunity you have now with this new government, with this new face, with the work that Kyrie has done to sort of serve as a platform. We're going to keep it going, okay? But wait until Kyrie, with your assistance, convinces this new government how much money it will save if it invests now in the social programs so that these are individuals that lead relatively productive lives to their functionality level, and they are not dependent on government assistance later on. They're looking for ways to get good PR and to make their mark. Please, lobby them. This is an absolute win-win for them, and I need you to be able to share that with them. If today is any kind of a spark for Autism Malaysia, yeah, I got it. And if today has any resonance in however the autism community of Malaysia rises up and continues on after this day, I will never be able to convince you of how honored I have been to be a small part of it. And all I can say is just thank you, good luck, shukran, peace.